hear me? Thanks everybody for being here. I'm a little discombobulated a little bit. This has been an interesting weekend. Peter Terry and Jay Bourne came in from New York City because Peter knew John from the 1960s, which is when I met John, when I was about 5 or 6 years old. So he's my oldest gay role model that I'm aware of. And he was an intimate part of this house when my parents bought it in 1978, and it started to have a series of raucous, many times illegal parties in this place in the South Loop that nobody knew about for decades. So he was family to our family, and I think one of those last great dandy gentlemen, certainly of Chicago. He just reminded me of a British elite sometimes, and every time he was at Thanksgiving, he elevated us to be of a gentler class or something like that, even though that's not what his roots were. He was just really an amazing part of how we grew up and how the kind of people that my family surrounded us by. So to have, as soon as I knew that he had passed away, I offered up the place because this was his home too. The last time he was here was about 2.5 years ago for my partner and my wedding, right in this room. So it's very special for us to host this here, and I thank you all for making the effort to come today. I look forward to hearing some great stories. So first we have A Wonderful Life, written by John Phillips, with Dan Mayer.
When we were helping John move out of the breakers and into Birchwood, we found a folder John had, and he had this inside of it. It was written by him. It's called A Wonderful Life by John Phillips. My small apartment was filled with a first-hand view of world history, including photos, business and legal documents, written notes, and books pertaining to my life, and meeting with so many celebrities, including Presidents Harry S. Truman and John F. Kennedy, Queen Elizabeth II, Mayor Richard J. Daley, Bette Midler, Rod Stewart, David Bowie, and Mikhail Baryshnikov. Walking down the halls in the North Shore Hotel, I often meditate, thanking God for a fantastic life. I've met wonderful people, some famous, some not so famous, but wonderful people overall. I was born on Christmas Eve, 1921, and moved to Evanston about 2 years ago from the Lakeview neighborhood in Chicago. Basically, I'm fairly healthy. As I said to someone the other day, when you live to be 91, parts begin to wear out. They're not going to last forever, but my memory is still razor sharp. I was born to an unmarried woman, abandoned by my mother, and raised in poverty by my grandparents in Streator, Illinois, about 80 miles southwest of Chicago. My grandparents died when I was 13, and I moved in with an aunt and uncle who lived nearby with their 2 daughters. There was a man who lived across the street who I had reason to believe was my father. When he died, I was devastated as I watched his funeral procession go by. I wondered how all these losses could happen to me, but I remember thinking, John, you have to pull yourself together. Maybe God has a purpose, so just accept it. I determined that day that friends would have to take the place of missing relatives. I was popular in high school, and my girlfriend and I were considered the best dancers in the school. When I was put in charge of designing for the prom, I decided to try to make the gym resemble the deck of a ship. I graduated from Streator Township High School in 1940, and I never returned for a reunion. I guess I moved on, and that period of my life was over. After graduating, I worked for Montgomery Wards, and then went to work in a factory that manufactured bottles because it paid more. After Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, a friend and I decided to list in the military services so that we could choose which branch of the service we wanted to join, as opposed to being drafted. I opted for the Navy and became a medic in 1942, although I eventually transferred into the U.S. Marine Corps. My military service was just another miracle in my life because I learned a lot. I worked for a division psychiatrist in combat, the first time a psychiatrist served on the front line. I learned that I could get things done. I spent 3 months on the island of Okinawa and the war in the Pacific as the war in the Pacific was winding down. The Army, Navy, all branches of the military gathered around the island to flush out the 1,000 or so enemy Japanese hiding in the caves and other places on that island. But it was the 6th Marine Corps Division, of which I was a member, that actually was on the island doing the work. For that extraordinary heroism, we received a presidential citation from President Truman. The citation continued, "By their valor and tenacity, the officers and men of the 6th Marine Division contributed materially to the conquest of Okinawa, and their gallantry in overcoming a fanatic enemy in the face of extraordinary danger and difficulty adds new luster to the Marine Corps history and to the tradition of the United States Naval Services." After leaving the military, I accepted a job at Edward Hines Jr. Veterans Administration Hospital just west of Chicago. I worked as a surgical technician there and often was asked to work alongside a number of different surgeons. One of these was Dr. Loyal Davis, a famous Chicago brain surgeon. Many years later, while working for the city of Chicago, I met a woman there named Edie Davis and asked her if she was related to Dr. Loyal Davis. He was her husband, and they had a daughter named Nancy, a movie starlet who later married Ronald Reagan. Edie said that I should meet Nancy someday, but that never happened. After a few years at Hines Hospital, with the aid of the GI Bill of Rights, I was able to enroll at the University of Illinois at Navy Pier, the Art Institute, and the Institute of Design. At the latter, some of the lecturers included such giants as Walter Gropius, Buckminster Fuller, Charles Eames, and Mies van der Rohe. I met a lot of people through the schools, and our loft on Ontario Street had the biggest parties with a lot of famous people attending. I was hired by the City of Chicago in 1954 and worked in the planning department and the Mayor's Office of Special Events for most of my 30-year career. My years with the city spanned the terms of Mayors Martin H. Cannelli, Richard J. Daley, Michael Bilandic, Jane Byrne, and the handling of VIP seating for the inauguration of Harold Washington. In 1954, I helped Chicago land the title of All-American City. One of my biggest breaks came in 1956 when Mayor Daley was prepping for a live speech on TV station WTTW. The mayor's office called my department looking for someone who could do legible printing for cue cards on the mayor's speech. I handled the task, and from then on, every time the mayor's office needed a sign or artwork, they would call on me. I worked on high-profile special events such as arranging meetings and dinners for presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, and much more. In 1959, I helped win the month-long Pan American Games for Chicago. Also in 1959, I was an integral part of Chicago's planning for the visit of Queen Elizabeth II and her husband Prince Philip in conjunction with the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I was a key component in making the dinner for 2,000 people in the ballroom of the Conrad Hilton Hotel that weekend extra special. I also was the one who led the Queen and the Mayor to their table of dignitaries at the far end of the room. One of the first things she saw when she entered the room was an 8-foot by 12-foot replica of her coat of arms on blue velvet, which I had arranged to have placed on the wall behind her chair. I was told that the U.S. State Department used that idea for official dinners throughout the country after that. That night remains a lifelong highlight. To know that something you did made a beautiful occasion very special, very nice, and dignified, and that your ideas were copied for future dinners, that meant a lot. I always tried to make the mayor look good. I also helped the mayor with a luncheon he planned at the Chicago Hotel to introduce a young senator from Massachusetts to the Cook County Democratic women in the late 1950s. It was one of the first, perhaps the first times that John F. Kennedy announced publicly that he intended to run for president of the United States. I am a news and political junkie. I like to know what's happening worldwide. I had a celebration on March 23, 2013. A musical show, Under a Rainbow Flag, had its premiere in Chicago. In story and song, it told of the struggles of gay men and women in the military during World War II. It was based on a collection of my life stories, and the main character is a young man named John Phillips. The action on stage is seen through his eyes. When it ended, the theater rang with applause. Then I was surrounded by friends congratulating me on this wonderful evening devoted to my life. It's an experience I shall never forget.
I'm Leo Schwartz, and if you want a copy of that, a copy of John's writing, I'll be happy to send it to you. I've got it in email, a PDF, and I can email it to you. The John I remember was an incredible raconteur. I loved his stories, and he was so good at telling them. I met him when he was in his mid-60s, and the first thing I noted, he had a great deal of energy. When he walked into a room, bam, he was there, and everybody noticed him. He was also a sweet, affable man with a deliciously wicked sense of humor. And I fondly recall two comments he made to me. The first one is, your heart can never be full of fear and gratitude at the same time, so it's best to be grateful. He also once remarked to me about how disappointed he was in people's appearance on TV. He said, if I want to see unattractive people, I'll ride the 36 bus. Around 2007 or so, I met with John to hear his life story. I knew he served in World War II, and I wanted to write a work about the service gays and lesbians had given to our country. I spoke with John about World War II, but I also spoke with a Vietnam vet and a Gulf War vet. My plan was to write a large, all-encompassing work for chorus and orchestra, one that would celebrate all the contributions of gays and lesbians to the American Armed Services. But something about John's story made me rethink that, and I realized that in his story was dramatic narrative. His story was a story that needed to be told, and so I wrote Under a Rainbow Flag, a tribute to my friend John, his service to the country, and the story of a young man from Streator, who discovered himself on a troop transport train among the men he loved and the honor they shared. I owe him so much of my career owed to that man telling me his story. So I now would like to introduce you to Sam Button Harrison, who played John Phillips in Under a Rainbow Flag, and Robert Allis, the show's music director. They'll perform a song from the show called One Day in His Arms.
Personal stories they'd like to share, if you'd like to come up now.
Peter? I'm going to ask people if you don't volunteer. So, Peter, you're first.
I feel I'm back in school. Where's the blackboard? I'm Pete Bourne. My wife Terry and my son Jay are here, and our friend Barbara Torr, who introduced, when she knew John the same time I did in the 60s. She's on Skype from New York. She couldn't make it. As has been said, you know, John was an incredible vital force. He lived in a world of people. He studied people. He was fascinated with people. You know, the better looking they were, the more fascinating. I thought I would explain, and we were roommates from about 1969 to 73 when I moved to New York to marry Terry. We lived in a basement apartment, Georgian Court, which is where Clark and Lafayette and North Avenue meet for $100 a month next to the laundry room. He had been, when I met him the first time, he had been living in a Mies van der Rohe high-rise on Lakeshore Drive. I was living in the basement with Rob Baker, who was a rock and roll critic for the Tribune, where I worked. And Rob was moving to New York, so I was looking for a roommate. And somehow John ended up in the apartment with a friend of his, a mutual friend of theirs. And we had a music room that was full of LPs. And he started looking at these records, one after another, after another, after another, after another. And that's when he decided he was moving into the basement. And he moved out of his high-rise. He never went to the Lyric Opera again, as far as I know. And went up and down Wall Street shopping for bell-bottoms. And he was completely transformed into a rock and roller. So much so that we're constantly going to bars and concerts, and in those days, the bars in Chicago were full of A&R men. There weren't a lot of customers. We were in a place called Quiet Night in Belmont, and he was at the bar, and he sees this blonde guy, and he's saying, well, you know, who do you represent? And he said, oh, I'm just here. You know, I came from England to meet the press. So, you know, John warms up to him immediately, hauls him over to the owner of the club and says, well, no, Richard, you should, you know, you need to hire my friend here to perform. And the kid says, no, I don't have a work visa. The State Department's mad at me. I wrote a song making fun of your space program. That was when he met David Bowie. And 2 years later, we ended up having a party for David, his wife Angie, his son Bowie. And that, you know, that became a routine. And John did a lot of things for Mayor Daley. One of the things he did was he was promoting the Reach Out program. Those were the days when there were riots every summer, and Operation Reach Out was Chicago's way of keeping youth quiet. So what was going on in 1971 was there was a group of 4 American ping pong players that went to mainland China, and that was the opening to China. A year later, Nixon went. So everybody was fascinated with these people, and one of the 4 was a 19-year-old kid called Glenn Cowan. And so everybody was fascinated with this thing called ping pong diplomacy, and Mayor Daley supposedly asked John what the youth of Chicago wanted that summer. And he said, ping pong. So he actually finagled a way to get Glenn to come to Chicago to do this ping pong demonstration. in the ghetto. And, you know, we had to go meet him at the airport. We had to go pick him up. He decided he had to do a class. So he needed a limousine. And the only person he knew with a limousine was Butch McGuire, and who had bought LBJ's limo, which had the weight of a Sherman tank because it was so fortified. So you go and we collect Glenn, and we go to the Playboy Mansion. Because in Chicago then, if you were anybody at all, you had to go do a state visit to Hugh Hefner. And so we're in the mansion waiting for Hefner to get up at midnight. And Bobby, Hef's assistant, is showing us around. And it's one of these new riche places where the floor came from Spain, and the ceiling came from England, and the walls came from France. There was a Picasso, if I recall, at one end, and there was a Franz Klein at the other end. And John, who had been drinking somewhat, points to that and says to Bobby, you know, I could have bought that for $25 and got it in color. She was horrified, to say the least. Because, you know, he and Klein had worked at the Art Institute together in the program. But, you know, John, he was, you know, obviously myself and my family and Barbara, you know, he will be a center post of our lives emotionally because he never, ever changed. He came, you know, he was fascinated with, he was very class conscious, and he had a great sense of dignity, and he couldn't get enough hearing about the rich and famous, but where he belonged was with the youth. He saw himself as a mentor to the next generation, to pass on the finer things of attitudes and behavior in life. And he would do everything he could to help out somebody younger. When Terry and I got married, his wedding present was a painting that had been done by a guy named Lindquist, who had wanted to be a painter, and he was so poor he couldn't afford the lessons or canvas or paint or anything. And John got him all that stuff. And he painted the picture, he painted this and gave it to John, he gave it to us. And we still have it hanging in our loft, and we will never, ever forget him. Thank you.
I have a short thing.
This is my sister Martha.
And I don't need a mic, but I'm just trying to, I'm obsessed with it. Okay. So anyway, okay. So John, here we go.
John can hear you.
Like they said, John. I grew up with John Phillips. I was fortunate enough that my parents, along with Peter and Terry, raised us around their friends, and now that I have an 18-year-old, I see the difference that made in my life. So our family consisted of just a whole group of cool people, and although we didn't know it at the time, we were raised in an unbelievably cool fashion. So I just have to share this memory of John, that every time I hear his name, I think of this. My parents didn't have a sitter or whatever. They would drag us to all these parties in the 60s. And again, not realizing how cool that was at the time, we would go to these parties and there'd be 100 adults and we're just like, you know, 6. And our thing at the parties was like we had to be careful opening doors because we never would know what we would find behind a door. So we went to a party in the 60s and Bette Midler was there. We didn't know what that meant at the time. but John Phillips had a Rolling Stones album with the zipper on it. And because I was 6 and I didn't know what to do with myself, it was the closest thing to a toy, I guess, that they could come up with. And I zipped that zipper 1,000 times that night until I'm pretty sure I broke it. And it's just funny in your life, like I don't remember anything before that, and I don't remember anything for like 8 years after that, but I will never forget that zipper. And you just don't know at what moment in your life you're gonna create a memory. And what really went with that zipper was decades following of him at Thanksgiving or him at very important times when Peter and Terry got married at our house. And he was just a part of our family. And I was so grateful that my stepdad Steve had him, that my mom had him, that we all had him, because some people are just gifts, and you know it when you see it. So I definitely love John Phillips.
Anybody else want to share a story? Don't be shy. Now? I don't want to call people out. Jay?
I do, but I want some other, like...
Anybody else? I know some people that know him from like 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 3 years ago. Any stories are welcome.
He's listening.
Go ahead. Okay, Jay.
We came all the way from New York.
I know, but still, it seems a little... So, Peter and Terry are my parents. I grew up in New York, but here in this house is like a second home. And, being a young queer kid, I know it's hard to believe, but I'm almost 40. It's not easy to have things, have people, have role models that you can hold on to in such a way that they're showing you the value of life in general, but in that moment in particular. You know, when I was really little, I was growing up in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and we were watching people come and go, and it felt like it was hard to know and embrace the value and the beauty of life. That was something that John, he just possessed that. I felt like he saw every room as a place where there could be an open window or an open door to see something of value. When I got married 6 years ago, my wedding gift was his second Lindquist. And we sat down, and Tracy was generous enough to take it upon herself to help him get all the way to New York from Chicago. And it was such a treasure to have him there. And I felt like all I wanted to do was to just say to all my friends, this is my Uncle John. Please make it your mission to spend 5 minutes with this man, because you'll get more in that 5 minutes than you could ever anticipate. You know, cherish him, honor him, the things he's seen and done. And he won't tell you half of it. So make sure you ask questions, because it's part of his humility and his beauty that he's not a show-off, he's not a know-it-all. And like my father said, he really wanted so much from them, right? I was fortunate enough to come out here last year and see him up at Evanston. And we're sitting there together, and he wasn't expecting me. I just sort of showed up, hoping he would be in the mood to see me. And his eyes just lit up. And he said, come, sit. We're going to have lunch, you know. And we're sitting there at lunch, and he just like leans over, and in barely a whisper, he says, there's so many old people in here. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know They don't want to have a good time. They don't want to have conversation. I don't know what I'm doing here. And it just, you know, so much of that life force that he garnered from being around young people. But this is all a segue to say, so we're sitting there during the wedding. We took a minute at the reception, and we're sitting on a couch, and he and my wife Betsy, and he said, "This is my gift to you." And I opened it up, and it's a beautiful painting. It's yay big, sort of a grayish white background, a bright green stem, and a red flower coming out of it. And he said, "This was hanging in my apartment when I lived with your father, and when he got married to your mother, there's a second one. It was from this young painter, you know, he had no money at all, and I would just do what I could for him, and the only way he could pay me back was in paintings, and I always kept the two together, and then I had this one by itself for all these years now, and so I'm going to give this one to you." And we have it up in our place, and I swear it's my most prized possession. Because every time I see it, I think of John, but I also think to myself, live life to the fullest. This is it, kid. Get everything you need out of it. Squeeze every ounce. You know, make him proud. And I guess that's my parting gift from him, is appreciating everything I possibly can out of life.
Any last comment? I know John was humble and shy, so I clearly get a lot of friends that were humble and shy. I have to say that I was so enthralled with Under a Rainbow Flag, of which name I still like. I'm lobbying for that name. That was a tremendous gift you gave to John and the cast. I go to things barely once. I went to that 3 times. And my partner, I just absolutely loved it, and I hope it gets staged again. That was phenomenal to have that for John, and the fact that he was still alive to see it and understand it was really tremendous. So I'm hoping somehow it gets more permanent in other places to see it. So we have some final words from Stephen, and then we have food and beverages, and people can hang out. We're going to have to get these folks to the airport, so we'll be skedaddling at 3:30, but feel free to hang out, and if you have any final words you want to share after Stephen, feel free to come up too. So.
I began knowing John like in the early 90s, but I actually met him for the first time 10 years earlier in 1983. He worked with the Chicago Mayor's Office of Special Events and came to my studio to pick up signs that I had painted for neighborhood summer festivals in Chicago. I had recently graduated from the School of the Art Institute and shared a warehouse loft with artist friends in East Ukrainian Village, where I made art and I was learning to paint signs to support my art making. Fred, my artist friend, and I were there working in the studio the day that John arrived. John liked the signs. He was interested to know how they were made. He was interested in the art that I was making. He was interested in the art that Fred was making, how we became involved in making art, and what we hope to accomplish in the future. He told us stories about his life that related to our experiences, and stories about many colorful people he had met. John was the most interesting sign customer to visit my studio so far. He also, when he left, he took a black and white Polaroid snapshot of the two of us holding up one of the neighborhood signs to document the occasion. Fred and I were 30. We had lots of hair then. It was the 1980s. I'd never met anyone before quite like John. He was sincere, thoughtful, engaging, and genuinely interested in getting to know people. He shared freely about his own experiences and listened intently to mine. He had the capacity to retain an abundance of detail from discussions we had and build on what he had learned in ensuing conversations. He was well researched in many areas of mutual interest, and always generous in pointing out things he thought might interest me. Although I can be reserved at times in social settings, I found it easy to open up when talking to John. John was big on architecture. He loved the work of Mies van der Rohe, Renzo Piano, Jeannie Gang, Tadeo Ando, and many others, including Buckminster Fuller, who he knew when he was at IIT studying at the Institute of Design. When John learned that I was planning a trip to paint graphics in Houston, he encouraged me to explore the DeMille collection, the private collection of John and Dominique DeMille, displayed in an equal remarkable building designed by Renzo Piano. An adjoining property, the Rothko Chapel, founded by the DeMilles, an intimate sanctuary designed by Philip Johnson with paintings by Mark Rothko, a chapel that welcomes people of all faiths and those concerned with peace, issues of peace, freedom, and social justice. It was a life-changing moment for me to be at this place for the first time. When I was planning to paint graphics in Dallas, John urged me to visit the Museum of Contemporary Art in Fort Worth, Texas, where I was introduced to the architecture of Japanese architect Tadeo Ando. It opened my mind and caused me to rethink my comprehension of architecture. Later in Chicago, John invited me to a public talk by Ando at the Art Institute of Chicago, a presentation of photographs at the Chicago Architecture Foundation, and in the following year, he obtained permission to invite a small, intimate group of close friends to view the interior of the Fred Eichner House on Wrightwood, the first private residence designed by Tadeo Ando in Chicago. John was always around and ready to help when help was needed. He volunteered with many community organizations, notably with Equality Illinois. Well into his 70s, John helped friends a third of his age pack their belongings into boxes, carry them down the stairs to a car or truck, and then help move them from one apartment to another. When his longtime friend, Paul Samuelson, suffered symptoms brought on by Parkinson's disease, John was there. Paul was a career illustrator who during retirement had traveled in Asia, painting watercolors in Bangkok and other Asian cities, literally sitting on the street painting what he saw. He then exhibited his watercolors in his Chicago apartment and invited his friends to see them. Paul was losing his motor skills and was having trouble walking. He had a walker, but he couldn't transport his painting materials around the apartment and handle the walker at the same time. So John hatched a plan and asked for my help. John remembered that he and Paul had once been in a neighborhood hardware store that had shopping carts. He decided we would go there, buy a shopping cart, put it in the car, and drive over to Paul's building. I had a compact car, and I was really very skeptical about the idea. But John was set on doing this, and so off we went. We got lost trying to find the hardware store. When we found it, there was no available parking, so we parked 4 blocks away. When we arrived at the store owner remembered Paul Samuelson. He was sorry to hear news that Paul was having trouble. He gave us the shopping cart and wished Paul well. After pushing the cart 4 blocks down North Broadway, somehow we managed to fit the shopping cart, John, myself, into the cart all at the same time. John was so pleased he was glowing. In retirement, the oversized desk in John's apartment was neatly organized. Yellow legal pads were nicely stacked, filled with notations on his to-do list, written with a black fine-line marking pen. The squares on his large calendar nearby were filled with doctor's appointments, meetings, events, and notes. When I came by to take him out, John was usually dressed and ready to go ahead of time. He recorded the names and addresses and phone numbers of people he knew on 3x5 index cards, which he kept in a stack, securely bound by a rubber band. Books filled the top shelf of his bookshelves. U-Haul moving boxes occupied the bottom shelves, jammed with manila folders containing newspaper and magazine clippings, photographs, event announcements, historical and personal documents, correspondence, and handwritten notes. The documents he collected constituted a record of his life as reflected by the stories of people he had known, had met, or people who had impacted his life in some way. For as long as I knew him, John lived modestly, placing little value in material possessions or comforts in life. He found the greatest meaning within the context of these boxes. in the files which documented scores of interesting people with whom he had interacted during his time on the planet. As long as I knew him, I never saw John fail to express gratitude. He believed that he had been granted a fortunate and fulfilling life. In 2003, the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh visited Chicago. The Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace advocate who had spoken out against violence suffered by innocents during the Vietnam War was later nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King. He came to Chicago to introduce mindful meditation practice to Catholic students at Loyola University. When John read about this in the Tribune, he called me and said, "I want to hear what this monk has to say." The 500-seat auditorium at Loyola was sold out. As luck would have it, I was practicing meditation with the Lakeside Sangha in Evanston at the time, the group that was instrumental in bringing Thich Nhat Hanh to Chicago, and I was painting signs for the event. So I recruited John to be my assistant sign hanger. After hanging the signs in the auditorium, we were both able to hear the talk. In short, John was blown away by the whole experience. The next day, he borrowed one of my Thich Nhat Hanh books and began practicing meditation with the Lakeside group. He continued participating for a couple of years and attended a weekend retreat in rural Illinois. During the last 30 years of John's life, John struggled with chronic emphysema. His shortness of breath triggered anxiety, which at times led to panic. Anxiety, in turn, could bring on his shortness of breath. John discovered that by practicing breathing exercises and walking meditation, his episodes of anxiety and shortness of breath occurred less frequently. Throughout his transitions from apartment in Aldine to senior living to assisted living and nursing home care, John experienced periods of confusion, anxiety, and frustration, partially due to the decline in his short-term memory. But most of the time when I saw John appeared grounded, relaxed, and centered. On several such occasions, John reported that he had practiced walking meditation in the hallway that day, which helped him calm his mind. I never stopped learning from John Phillips and the example he set. I'm honored to have been one of his many friends and grateful to have had a unique opportunity to get to know him better, and I will surely miss him.
Well, thank you everybody for, we had no idea how many people would come and celebrate John. We know he affected so many people, and so many people that he affected are no longer with us as well. So this was also in their memory, and we're really, really happy to share his life with you today in our home that was his home too. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.